Sunrise on Scenic Highway 30A has a way of making the Gulf look like it's keeping secrets, and some of those secrets have fins. This is The Rise the Limit, Chapter 7, Coastal Dune Lakes, Cross-Currents on 30A. Last chapter traced the long, slow unraveling of Spanish Florida, from conquistador lawsuits and mission collapses to Bernardo de Galvez's cannons at Pensacola and the Adams-Onis Treaty handing the whole peninsula to the United States, sovereignty settled by paperwork rather than powder. Now the history gives way to natural history as the narrator follows 30A's dune lakes where resident bottlenose dolphins work the shallows, manatees slip through breached outfalls in summer, and a rough November encounter near Blue Mountain Beach points toward a Risso's dolphin running with a male coalition during late-season mating. From bull sharks ambushing baitfish at tannin-stained outfalls to monarchs fueling up on goldenrod for Mexico, the coast turns out to be less a scenic drive and more a daily negotiation between species, including the ones doing the driving. The rain from our abrupt retreat at Redfish Lake blew out by morning, parting ways with the skeletal specters of the Narvaez expedition and the heavy, armor-plated echoes of Spanish failure. I turned my rental car toward the coast just as the eastern horizon began to bruise with light. Grayton Beach offers a topographic reprieve from the vertical concrete aspirations of the surrounding resort towns, presenting a landscape that looks largely as it did before the invention of the 4-story condo on a 30-foot lot. To witness sunrise here is to watch a monochromatic world discover color. As the light hits the blinding white quartz sand, the dunes hum with reflected heat even before the sun fully clears the tree line. The air tastes of salt spray and oxidized pine needles, and the Gulf transitions from a pre-dawn steel gray into a gradient of tannin-stained amber and a startling, impossible emerald. The wind whips the sea oats into a frenzy, creating a rhythmic hissing that competes with the percussive thrum of the surf while the humidity wraps around you like a wet wool blanket. It is a raw, physical reality that grounds the modern visitor, a deceptively empty stage waiting for the local ecosystem to wake up and take its places. The terrestrial life on these shimmering sugar sands is highly specialized and occasionally perilous. The Choctaw Hatchie beach mouse, a federally endangered subspecies endemic to these dunes, is the Frank Lloyd Wright of the coast. With pale tawny fur that renders it nearly invisible against the quartz grains, this dune architect buries sea oat seeds that germinate and stabilize the entire sand system. They share the Point Washington State Forest with the Florida black bear, an opportunistic scavenger that frequently forgets it is a forest animal and wanders onto the beach for a swim, presumably to cool off after a long day of being a bear. Undergirding all this biological drama is the deep history of human appetite. The resources that feed the bears today also fed the Fort Walton culture and earlier indigenous groups, who left behind massive shell middens, ancient trash piles proving humanity's timeless love for an oyster roast. In the 16th century, the Spanish survivors of the Narvaez expedition, having failed disastrously to conquer Florida, recorded eating oysters for months at a time. Cabeza de Vaca, the treasurer turned shaman, documented coastal communities subsisting on these bivalves when other food was scarce. The Spanish also noted the presence of bison and opossums, trying to catalogue a landscape that resisted their maps and logistical planning. To move from the sand into the water on a calm day is to participate in a high-stakes dance known as the stingray shuffle. This maneuver involves dragging one's feet through the sand with the awkward deliberation of a toddler learning to skate, a necessary precaution against the serrated barb of a stingray. The barb delivers a heat-labile protein-based venom, a fancy way of saying the toxin is cooked by heat. If you are tagged with the 30A tattoo, you must soak the wound in scalding water between 110 and 113 degrees to denature the poison, all while contemplating the risk of a secondary Vibrio bacteria infection. It adds a delightful thrill of potential necrosis to a casual wade. As the water warms to a specific 68 degrees, the summer season ushers in the snowbirds of the sea. West Indian manatees drift in to breach the sand berms of coastal dune lakes like Western Lake, seeking the calm, brackish waters. Despite their bulk, these gentle, blubbery potatoes are incredibly high maintenance regarding the thermostat. If the temperature drops even slightly, they evacuate with the urgency of a boomer fleeing the winter in Michigan. They are the modern echoes of Metaxotherium floridanum, an extinct dugong whose fossilized ribs constitute the state's most common vertebrate souvenir, confirming that this coast has been a retirement home for millions of years. Further out in Choctawhatchee Bay and the open Gulf, I quickly discovered that the local marine mammals practice a form of biological elitism as rigid and exclusionary as the 16th-century royal court of Castile. Bottlenose dolphins are effectively the landed gentry. A resident population patrols the shallow, seagrass-filled VIP lounge of the bay year-round. These townies are smaller and lighter, physically adapted for the coastal flats, and they categorically refuse to mingle with the darker, larger transient population that cruises the deeper open water. It is a classic tale of patricians versus plebeians, played out with dorsal fins. Gulf pods, scars, courtship, and converging waters. Standing on the sugar-white quartz of Blue Mountain Beach, I confidently observed the Gulf of Mexico, ready to catalogue the deep with the precision of a man who remembered his polarized goggles. The cooling air of November soon revealed an ocean spectacle that resembled a prison riot. It challenged my grasp on marine biology and suggested the local ecosystem was highly organized and frequently violent. The commotion in the surf was immediate. A pod of dolphins erupted into an aquatic brawl, churning the water with aggressive tail slaps and leaping passes. Among the combatants was a creature that shattered any complacent identification. It possessed a tall, hooked dorsal fin and a blunt, bulbous head, entirely lacking the expected friendly beak. I stood pointing at the chaotic horizon like a bewildered tourist, asking the universe, "Is this a killer whale?" It was a Risso's dolphin, a species operating as the battle-hardened veteran of the cetacean world. Born dark grey, they acquire a distinct pallor from physical trauma rather than age. Their skin acts as a living ledger of their habits, covered in white linear scars accumulated from the beaks of squid they hunt and the teeth of rivals they annoy. This heavily scarred appearance makes older individuals look like battered ghosts haunting the deep water, a visual completely divorced from pristine aquarium aesthetics. The brutality was not territorial defense, it was an actual date. November hosts a secondary breeding season here, and the bottlenose approach to romance relies on startling aggression. The fighting was a courtship ritual executed by a super-alliance of males. These coalitions, typically 2 or 3 bachelor dolphins working in concert, aggressively herd a female. They bite and slam their tails in a display that human observers might categorize less as flirting and more as actionable assault. Nature apparently favors significantly more blunt force trauma than standard human mixers. This chaotic theatre enforced the rigid social divisions existing just offshore. While the stable clique of 179 resident dolphins sticks to the shallow seagrass beds of Choctawhatchee Bay, the open Gulf belongs to these massive transient pods. The larger drifters are easily identified by the circular scars left by the cookie-cutter shark, a parasitic, deep-water nightmare that extracts ice cream scoop bites from passing flesh, collecting a grim, physical toll from anything swimming below the continental shelf. The sheer concentration of predators here is partly a product of a specific historical impatience just west near Destin. The East Pass currently funnels the tide and corrals the baitfish these dolphins exploit. However, this geography began when local fishermen, tired of the natural drift, took shovels to the barrier island in 1929 and dug a trench to relieve flooding. The water immediately took over and scoured out the violent channel that exists today. Give the Gulf of Mexico an inch and it will carve a permanent hydrodynamic buffet. Watching the Risso's dolphin fade back into the cobalt depths with its scarred flank gleaming, I realized the surface was a perfect deception. We look at the water and see a recreational playground. The marine life sees a tactical map shaped by century-old dredging and aggressive hierarchies. I was left to conclude the water was safe enough from the sand, provided you were not a migrating squid, though the dark blending of fresh and salt water near the sandbars suggested entirely different. Apex predators might already be hunting in the shallows. Sharks and sonar, science's new swim safety standard. While the transient dolphins operating offshore function like a highly visible aquatic street gang, the dark mixing zones at the edge of the sandbars conceal an entirely different kind of threat. The shallow water along Scenic Highway 30A frequently hosts a chemically enhanced infiltration unit known as the bull shark. It is a solitary agent of chaos, and unlike the dolphins, it does not care for pageantry. The mood along this specific stretch of the Emerald Coast shifted with operatic abruptness on June 7, 2024. In a mere 90 minutes, hardly enough time to properly ripen a sunburn, two separate shark encounters occurred near Watersound and Inlet Beach. The incidents injured 3 swimmers and prompted officials to close the shoreline with the urgency of a quarantined clean room. While authorities were quick to label this cluster a statistical anomaly, the event highlighted the specific geological machinery that turns this coastline into a high-stakes arena. Most oceanic predators require the strict salinity of the open sea to keep their cells from rupturing, but the bull shark possesses a liver and kidney system capable of distinct osmoregulation. This physiological trick allows it to thrive in the murky, low-salinity mixing zones that a great white naturally avoids. The adaptation is so effective that the species regularly travels over 1,000 miles up the Mississippi River, reaching as far as Illinois, presumably to lodge a formal complaint about the winters. This tolerance for fresh water makes the 30A corridor particularly vulnerable to intrusion, largely due to the region's coastal dune lakes. When heavy rains force these lakes to breach their sand berms, they pour a plume of dark, tannin-stained fresh water into the clear Gulf. To a wading tourist, this looks like muddy tea washing over the sand. To a bull shark relying on electroreception rather than sight, it is the perfect camouflage. The trap is baited by massive schools of menhaden that congregate here with a distinct lack of survival instinct. The coast's second sandbar acts as a natural corral, trapping the baitfish in a shallow trough between the bar and the beach. When a scent trail draws a predator in, the result is a chaotic feeding frenzy. If a shark enters this waist-deep trough, it finds itself swimming shoulder to fin with human beachgoers. The resulting cases of mistaken identity are entirely predictable. Fortunately, the risk drops in late autumn when the menhaden finally migrate offshore. Following the 2024 incidents, local municipalities shifted from untested panic to active surveillance. Authorities began deploying artificial intelligence shark detectors like clever boys, utilizing multi-beam sonar transducers anchored to the sea floor like silicon sentries. The system acts as a judgmental underwater critic meant to observe the swim patterns of local biology. It is designed to distinguish the vertical, up-and-down frolic of a dolphin from the lateral, side-to-side undulation of a shark. One has to assume the shark rarely pauses to distinguish the lateral panic of a swimming human from the distress of an injured fish. Ideally, this digital guardian detects a large signature and alerts lifeguards before the animal reaches the shallow trough. Even without the bull sharks hiding in the lake outfalls, the immediate shoreline enforces its own hierarchy. Small blacktip sharks frequently treat the knee-deep swash zone as their personal buffet line. These are not lumbering deep-water leviathans, but nervous, kinetic missiles known for herding baitfish against the beach until the water boils with desperate silver scales. They hunt with a frantic energy that brings them within mere feet of wading tourists. They slice through the surf with an arrogance that suggests they know exactly who possesses the teeth in this particular transaction. Watching them thrash in the shallows is a jarring reminder that the Gulf is a wild dining room where the seating chart is determined solely by speed. Despite the deployment of high-tech sonar arrays, the human reaction to such encounters remains governed by the availability heuristic. Our brains naturally view a highly publicized shark incident as imminent doom, while entirely ignoring the probable finality of a traffic accident on the drive to the beach. Yet the water offers no guarantees of clarity. As I waded cautiously through the surf one afternoon, I navigated thick patches of dune grass. This seasonal algae bloom provides dense, floating cover for both baitfish and predators. Standing there surrounded by vegetable soup and invisible wildlife, I realized that relying on a statistical probability of safety provides almost zero comfort when you cannot see your own feet. It proved, in a moment of damp anxiety, that a biology degree does not protect you from being bitten. It merely helps you identify what might be eating you while you bleed, prompting a distinct urge to retreat from the salt and seek higher, drier ground in the surrounding dunes. Coastal crucible, dunes, dwellers, and destiny's light. Paranoia is a potent fuel for exploration. Acting on the urge to abandon the toothy gulf for the solid ground of South Walton's scrub, I quickly learned that safety in the terrestrial is an illusion. The scenic corridor, with its whispering pines and rare dune lakes, is not merely a resort backdrop. It is a contested biological theater where ancient reptiles engage in a silent, slithering war for tenancy. If the ocean belongs to the sharks, the sand belongs to the sea turtles. Between May and October, loggerheads and green sea turtles arrive to nest. These matriarchs navigate by the Earth's magnetic field using natal homing, a feat of biological geolocation that makes my reliance on a smartphone map seem pitifully inadequate. Hauling themselves ashore to lay eggs, they often appear to weep salt tears. While this looks like an emotional response to local real estate prices on 30A, biology specifies it is merely a specialized gland excreting excess salt absorbed from the ocean. Hatchlings face a modern trial. Historically, they navigated toward the moon's reflection on the water to find the sea. Today, beachfront properties offer a brighter horizon. To prevent confused newborn turtles from marching confidently into hotel lobbies, the county enforces wildlife lighting ordinances, mandating amber bulbs that mimic the moon rather than a convenience store. If a female turtle finds the beach too loud, too bright, or cluttered with abandoned beach chairs, she will perform a false crawl. She emerges from the surf. She surveys the chaotic scene. She immediately turns back to sea without laying eggs, reflecting a level of disgusted resignation I have often felt when mistakenly entering a crowded restaurant. Just behind the dunes, the coastal dune lakes harbor a formidable resident. The American alligator thrives here. While they are freshwater specialists lacking the salt-processing glands of their crocodile cousins, they tolerate the brackish mixing zones. When heavy rains force the lakes to breach and tannin plumes hit the surf, alligators occasionally enter the Gulf corridor. They wash off the duckweed, unnerve a few tourists near the outfalls, and retreat before the salinity becomes uncomfortable. Long before the first beach umbrella was planted, the indigenous Weeden Island culture viewed the alligator as a dietary staple. Today, the species has recovered so strongly from near extinction that it was removed from the federal endangered list in 1987. Yet it remains listed by state and federal agencies as threatened by similarity of appearance. This bureaucratic classification essentially means they look too much like rarer crocodilians to be hunted freely. It is a masterful legal distinction, suggesting the alligator survives largely due to a case of mistaken identity. Moving deeper into the scrub, the hazards become smaller but no less potent. The Florida cottonmouth, a heavy-bodied viper, haunts the lake edges and occasionally commutes through the surf. Juvenile cottonmouths are particularly deceptive. They sport a bright yellow tail tip that they wiggle like a worm to lure frogs and lizards. This behavior is known as caudal luring, which is essentially fishing with one's own body parts. The region's pine flats are also the domain of the eastern diamondback rattlesnake, the heaviest venomous snake in North America. This reptile is a masterpiece of evolutionary lethality. It carries a hemotoxic payload that dissolves tissue and shuts down circulatory systems. It is a coiled spring of biological destruction that commands absolute fear from primates and inspires centuries of myth and malice. Paradoxically, they are incredibly shy introverts who would overwhelmingly prefer to sit in a hole and not talk to anyone. The true landlord of these dry, sandy ridges is the gopher tortoise. A federally threatened species, this reptilian civil engineer digs burrows up to 40 feet deep. These tunnels create subterranean bomb shelters that protect them from forest fires and predators. They serve as the benevolent hosts of the forest, providing lodging for hundreds of other species, though their hospitality is likely unintentional. Up in the canopy above the tortoises, a different war rages. The native green anole, a charming lizard capable of flashing a pink throat fan called a dewlap, is slowly being displaced by the invasive brown anole. The brown cousins are aggressive. They thrive in the disturbed habitats of parking lots and landscaped gardens, flashing an orange-red dewlap like a warning flare. In a startling display of rapid evolution, the green anoles adapted in less than 20 years by moving to higher perches and developing larger toe pads to grip the smoother leaves of the upper canopy. It is a biological gentrification battle played out in millimeter increments. Walking along the edge of Grayton Beach, the heat radiated off the quartz sand. The scrub was silent, save for the wind in the palmettos. I looked down at the asphalt path, expecting to see the tracks of a great predator or the dragline of a heavy serpent. Instead, near the pavement's edge, I saw a small, distinct disturbance in the sand. The tiny footprints of a lizard scurried across the road, stopped abruptly at a discarded soda cap, and vanished into the brush. 30. A wildlife. Florida coast's hidden dangers. The creeping reptiles of the underbrush had proven elusive, leaving me to search for the warm-blooded overlords of this delicate strip of sand. Historical accounts from early Spanish explorers noted lions, panthers, bears, and a strange beast with a pouch for its young, the opossum. Those 16th-century navigators viewed the Panhandle as a confusing obstacle course rather than a real estate opportunity. And their records prove that weird biology has long been Florida's primary export. Looking skyward, the avian drama offers a darker narrative. The recovery of the bald eagle following the 1972 ban on DDT is a triumph of conservation. Though the eagles themselves are somewhat less than noble in character, they are enthusiastic practitioners of kleptoparasitism, a scientific term for violent aerial mugging. I watched an eagle harass an osprey over Western Lake, badgering the smaller raptor until it dropped its catch. The osprey is a biological marvel equipped with reversible toes and barbed foot pads. Those feet act essentially as Velcro for trout. The bird zips its own eyes shut with a transparent third eyelid before diving. Once successful, it arranges the fish head forward to reduce drag, turning its dinner into an aerodynamic torpedo. The osprey is a master of physics, if not playground politics. October brings a quieter invasion. The 30A corridor acts as a funnel for the monarch butterfly migration, specifically the Methuselah generation. These insects navigate via a time-compensated sun compass in their antennae. They delay reproduction to live up to 9 months, fueling up on goldenrod to survive the 3,000-mile flight to Mexico. It is a staggering feat of endurance that makes my drive down the coast look positively sedentary. Yet the most immediate danger on this road is not the shark or the bear. It is the white-tailed deer. As twilight fell, I reflected on the statistical reality that Bambi is far more lethal than Jaws. Insurance claims confirm that deer collisions are the premier hazard of the American road, spiking in the faltering light of autumn. I recited the internal monologue of the cautious driver: slow down, scan the shoulder, anticipate the second deer that inevitably follows the first. It is a routine of absolute vigilance. I learned this the hard way in 2022 after striking a deer at sunset. A brutal reminder that nature's itinerary rarely aligns with human traffic laws. The woods grew dark, the road emptied, tires screeched sharply on the asphalt. A heavy thump followed. After that jarring reality check, the hidden dangers of the dark tree line lost all appeal. I found myself craving a retreat from the heavy canopy and the sudden hazards of the highway. The coastal dune lakes offered a more controlled environment, drawing me back toward their calm margins where life moved at a much more deliberate and predictable pace. Florida Panhandle birds, rare herons, plovers, historical hunts. Salvaging my nerves after navigating the deer-infested gauntlet of Highway 30A, where the local fauna view windshields not as barriers but as tragic romantic partners, I parked near the coastal dunes to seek company less likely to cost me an insurance deductible. The transition from the adrenaline of the road to the stillness of the beach was jarring. That serenity was immediately broken by a great blue heron glaring at a nearby fisherman with the specific, unblinking intensity of the "I am once again asking for your financial support" meme. These birds, along with their egret cousins, stand like overworked, majestic waiters along the margins of western and eastern lakes. They tolerate our presence only because we occasionally drop a minnow or, in the case of the bolder individuals, leave a bucket of bait unguarded. I watched the great blue heron wade through the shallows with a prehistoric dignity. It moved as if it remembered a time when its ancestors ate ours. It is not alone in this landscape, as the tricolored heron and the snowy egret also patrol these calm waters, though they lack the sheer gravitational pull of the great blue. When dusk approaches, the shift changes. The yellow-crowned night heron clocks in near the lake outfalls where the fresh water breaches the sand berm. These birds are the graveyard shift specialists. They stalk the rack line for ghost crabs with a technique naturalists describe as meticulous. They will catch a crab, drop it, and re-grab it to ensure the perfect angle for swallowing. It is a level of fussiness I usually associate with toddlers eating spaghetti. The continuing presence of these birds is a tale of survival against high fashion and colonial hunger. In the 16th century, the Narvaez expedition of 1528 stumbled through this very terrain, badly mapped and full of regret. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, the expedition's treasurer and eventual long-distance walker, specifically recorded these avian multitudes in his accounts. He likely drafted those notes while wondering why he had not just stayed in Spain. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, however, the birds faced a threat far more precise than a starving conquistador. Commercial plume hunters invaded the coastal rookeries to harvest feathers for women's hats, nearly wiping out the wading population for the sake of millinery aesthetics. Today, species like the little blue heron, reddish egret, and snowy egret have recovered just enough to be listed as a species of special concern in Florida. Seeing them fish in the twilight feels like witnessing a victory lap against the concept of the fedora. Leaving the lakes for the Gulf beaches, I found the sand occupied by a different, deeper madness. Terns and plovers have decided, against all evolutionary logic, to lay their eggs directly on the ground in one of the most heavily trafficked tourist corridors in the American South. Least terns, perhaps realizing the floor is lava or at least full of beachgoers, have developed a quirk of nesting on flat gravel rooftops, turning local warehouses into noisy nurseries. Down on the sand, the snowy plover takes a riskier approach. Walking near Grayton and Deer Lake State Parks involves a terrifying game of hopscotch. The plover eggs mimic the shell grit so perfectly that avoiding them requires the focus of a bomb disposal unit. The existence of the snowy plover is a harrowing biological gamble, a high-stakes standoff where a creature the size of a tennis ball attempts to raise a family in the path of beach carts, wandering dogs, and heavy-footed joggers. A single footprint can obliterate a generation. A wayward tire is an apocalypse. By forcing humans to rope off critical dune habitats, their survival indirectly helps stabilize a coastline constantly under siege by hurricanes and erosion, placing the weight of coastal management on their fragile, hollow-boned shoulders. Seeing a banded, day-old chick stumble across the sand at Deer Lake is undeniably cute, strictly in a cotton ball with toothpicks for legs sort of way. Federally threatened piping plovers also winter here, fueling up on the flats near Camp Helen for their long spring commute north. They joined the killdeer in the regional inventory, scurrying across the sand as I concluded my patrol. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows over the water where the terns dived and the herons resumed their croaking night watch. As the rain clouds gathered, I looked past the dunes toward the dense pine barrens and floodplain forests further inland, where the history of Florida's wildlife features a much quieter, emptier canopy. Lost lords and parakeets, Florida's last stand. The inland silence of the Panhandle forests feels heavy and almost accusatory. While the coast acts as a living theater of avian adaptation, the deep woods north of the 30A corridor hold the memory of two spectacular ecological collapses. Leaving the restless colonies of terns and plovers behind, I guided the car away from the blinding quartz beaches and drove toward the shadowed river bottoms. This was not a quest to see birds, but to see the empty spaces they left behind. The first ghost was the Carolina parakeet. North America's only native parrot once painted Florida skies in raucous streaks of green and yellow. By the late 19th century, their empire of noise had shrunk to the Florida peninsula. Here they gathered in cocklebur patches with the chaotic energy of a crowded diner. Unluckily for the parakeet, a highly gregarious nature and a taste for seeds put them in direct operational conflict with local farmers. To agriculturalists, these were not beautiful endemic birds. They were flying rats that raided crops with industrial efficiency. The collision of ecology and economics is rarely polite, and in this environment, it proved fatal. The exit of the species was protracted. Long before farmers eradicated them, indigenous people of the Mississippian era saw value in the parakeets beyond mere aesthetics. Bones recovered from ceremonial mounds suggest the birds were used in rituals or costumes, likely because wearing a bright green bird has always been a solid power move for the priesthood. Centuries later, the final captive bird, a stoic male named Incas, died at the Cincinnati Zoo in 1918. That loss supposedly brought the localized parrot lineage to a quiet close. Yet Florida retains a strange postscript. Two controversial eggs collected on the Kissimmee Prairie in 1927 still sit in museum drawers. Supported by local interviews, they remain a biological cold case, suggesting the species lingered just past the point of hope. Deep in the Choctawhatchee bottomlands, the air is thick enough to chew, and the trees stand in rotting magnificence. This was the cathedral of the ivory-billed woodpecker. The creature was so impressive it earned the nickname Lord God Bird, a title derived from the stunned blasphemy onlookers would utter upon seeing a woodpecker with a 2-foot wingspan. It was a crow-sized architectural critic that relied on massive decaying trunks to source beetle grubs. But a specific need for big cavities and complex floodplain forests guaranteed its ruin. When industrial logging swept through to feed the timber hunger of a growing nation, the old-growth bottomlands were thinned, and the bird was evicted. Spotting an ivory-bill today would not just rewrite textbooks. It would turn these swamps into a restricted zone so fast you would arguably be safer smuggling plutonium than claiming a sighting. Even so, the ghost of the Lord God Bird haunts the Choctawhatchee River just north of Santa Rosa Beach. In 2005 and 2006, Auburn University researchers emerged from the mosquito chokehold with field notes logging 14 sightings and acoustic recordings of the bird's signature double knock drums and Kent calls. They described white trailing wing edges, the holy grail of field marks. Experts at Cornell called the evidence tantalizing, which is scientific code for wanting to believe the best while looking at footage resembling a Bigfoot sighting filmed on a potato. The wider professional community remained split. A 2-year follow-up failed to produce the definitive high-definition proof the modern world demands. Legally, the ivory bill exists in purgatory. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed delisting the bird due to extinction, but held off on a final ruling in October 2023 to review new material. It holds the rank of GH, or globally historical occurrence. Bureaucratic caution ensures that conservation law is applied based on hard documentation rather than legends, lone anecdotes, or the wishful thinking of a traveler staring into a dense swamp. Standing on the edge of the river, the meta-narrative of the region shifts into focus. The immediate 30A experience is defined by water and geology, the quartz sand, the shifting dune lakes, and the deep aquifer. The inland story is defined by what was taken away. The rapid logging and agricultural expansion that altered the landscape erased the complex floodplain architecture required by these specialized birds long before the first condo rose on the dunes. I returned to the car, abandoned the ghosts to their river, and drove back toward the polished, paved reality of the coast. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 7, Coastal Dune Lakes Cross-Currents on 30A. From Risso's dolphins working the mixing zones to monarchs fueling up on goldenrod before Mexico, this stretch of 30A turns out to be less a beach road and more a collision point, where deep-time geology, seasonal migration, and very present danger all arrive at once. In Chapter 8, we trade the shoreline for the longleaf corridor and follow the Euchee people, a Scots trader's son named Timpucci Kinnard, and a 6-month scouting journey along 2 coasts that was always searching for ground that kept slipping away. If this journey caught your interest, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conquistadors and Condos. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community on Patreon. Until next time, this has been The Rise the Limit. Building a coastal paradise requires clearing away the previous tenants, a ruthless real estate logic that perfectly explains the chaotic sequence of displacement across the Florida Panhandle. Walking the paved expanse of the Timpucci Trail today, flanked by immaculate resort architecture and the anarchic brush of scrub oak, a visitor might reasonably assume the namesake of this 18-mile stretch of asphalt was a retired pickleball champion or a developer with a knack for zoning variances. He was, instead, a leader of the Euchee. Their journey to this coast resembled a desperate geopolitical chess match played across a burning board rather than any modern vacation. The Euchee, or Soyaha, call themselves the Children of the Sun, a title that predates the Florida Tourism Board by several centuries. Their story does not begin among these white quartz dunes, but far to the north, within the 16th-century river valleys of eastern Tennessee. The Euchee were the grammatical holdouts of the ancient Southeast. Their language is a linguistic isolate, completely unrelated to the dominant Muskogean tongues surrounding them, and they maintained this stubborn linguistic solitude with impressive dedication. While their neighbors communicated through mutually intelligible language families, the Euchee spoke a tongue no one else could decipher from their towns of Chestoa and Chestowe on the Hiwassee River. It was here that Hernando de Soto might have encountered them in the 1540s under the name Chisca, a historical proposition that scholars handle with the cautious enthusiasm of a bomb disposal technician gripping the red wire. History rarely allows any group to stay put on a contested map. By the early 1700s, the Euchee lost their Tennessee foothold to the fiery mechanism of colonial warfare. In 1714, a Cherokee war party obliterated Chestowe, pushing the Euchee off the regional ledger by the following year. They abandoned the river valleys and moved south to survive the shifting borders of imperial violence. Seeking security in numbers, they entered a pragmatic alliance with the Muskogee Confederacy in Georgia and Alabama. By 1715, maps began to show Euchee towns clustered near Lower Creek settlements on the Chattahoochee River. This functioned as a neighborhood watch arrangement, where the Euchee provided additional gunmen, but resolutely refused to weave their unique language into the Creek vernacular. The final leg of this odyssey brought them down to the Florida Panhandle, a region experiencing a catastrophic vacancy event. The indigenous Fort Walton culture had collapsed by 1500, and English and Creek raids in 1704 eliminated the historic Appalachee network. These consecutive disasters left the territory effectively unoccupied, a sterile euphemism for a landscape emptied by disease and war. Driven by the same currents of colonial displacement that sent emerging Seminole groups drifting south, the Euchee moved into this coastal void. It was on this precarious frontier, in the late 18th century, that a Scottish trader named Timothy Kinnard arrived and set up shop. Euchee Chief Sam Story, Frontier Power Shift. You might assume that tracking the lineage of a Scottish trader who vanished into the Florida Panhandle simply requires a decent map and a tolerance for humidity. But is history ever that cooperative? Standing on the banks of the Choctawhatchee River, where the water moves with the lethargy of a drowsy alligator, I consider the peculiar legacy of that inland migration. It was here, amid the silence of the pines and the ghosts of the Fort Walton culture, that the baton of power passed from a shadowy Scottish father to a son who would define the region's last indigenous chapter. Kinnard possessed the good sense to be a middleman. Known as a factor, he funneled European necessities like metal tools and firearms into the interior in exchange for deerskins, which functioned as the Bitcoin of the 1790s. His smartest diplomatic maneuver was marrying a Euchee woman. Because Euchee society played by matrilineal rules, their son, regardless of his father's tartan-wearing origins, was fully accepted into the tribe. His name was Timpoochee Kinnard, a Muskogean patronymic that translates to Little Timothy. It is admittedly difficult to project an aura of fearsome authority when your royal title is essentially Tim Jr., but history assures us he pulled it off. To the settlers, he was simply Sam Story, a prosperous chief who managed a little kingdom by the sea from his headquarters at the Old Place on the south bank of Bruce Creek. I try to visualize this delicate but functional balance Sam Story maintained before the world turned upside down. He was a man of peace and apparently a man of significant reproductive output, boasting a large family of children who were reportedly taller and better mannered than everyone else's. His sons carried names like Swift Hunter and Sleeping Fire, while his daughters were known as Leaping Water and Quiet Water. It sounds idyllic until you realize the logistics involved. Sam ran a fleet of market boats, rough crafts loaded with produce and jerked venison hams, from Story's Landing down to Pensacola Bay. It was a commercial empire built on dried meat and river currents, operating under the nose of Spanish authorities who were technically in charge but effectively absentee landlords. Diplomacy is mostly catering and convenient real estate. The disruption arrived in the spring of 1820, not with a bang, but with a Scot named Neil McClendon, who was in the market for a high-quality hog range. McClendon, a pioneer from North Carolina, had grown restless, which is pioneer code for bored and land-hungry. He traveled to Pensacola, where merchants and an old doctor swore the Choctaw-Hatchee country was a hermit place hemmed in by rivers, offering most bewitching descriptions of the land. More importantly, they vouched for Sam's story, describing him as a most wonderful Indian full of born way. Intrigued by this review, which sounds like a 5-star rating on an 1820s travel app, McClendon and his brother-in-law Daniel D. Campbell bushwhacked their way to Bruce Creek. The meeting was less a clash of civilizations and more a dinner party. Sam Story, having recently returned from Pensacola, did not greet these interlopers with arrows. Instead, he welcomed them with strong black coffee, fresh cornbread, and the inevitable jerked venison hams. In a move that would define the future of Walton County, the chief chose alliance over conflict, offering the Scots safe passage and land. Settling a territorial dispute over a caffeine buzz and a plate of dried meat is not as silly as it sounds, except that trading an empire for breakfast clearly is. Euchee Valley Vision, Sam Story's Golden Alliance. Standing on the sandy banks of the Choctaw-Hatchee, I try to picture that initial handshake in the spring of 1820. What followed that breakfast of cornbread and venison was a momentary lapse in the usual frontier brutality. Between 1820 and 1832, the Euchee Valley transformed into an anomaly known as the Golden Valley, where for 12 disparate years everyone generally agreed not to kill each other. It was a period of such startling cooperation that it feels less like history and more like a deleted scene from a highly optimistic draft of America. The transfer of power began with a gesture combining diplomatic genius and practical pragmatism. Chief Sam Story handed his personal tomahawk to his new friend Neil McClendon. Story's instruction was simple. McClendon should use the weapon to blaze out a home for himself where he liked. Following the tradition of the tomahawk rite, McClendon took the hatchet, explicitly noted in historical records as one never stained with the blood of a pale face, a comforting feature in a loner weapon. He walked into the woods and began hacking notches into trees to define his property lines. It remains a rare historical instance where a heavily armed Scotsman chopping at unsuspecting oaks signaled peace rather than an impending massacre. The relationship that bloomed from these notched trees was absurdly functional. They hunted together. They traded together. The Scots, a people historically fond of dour precision, fell absolutely in love with Sam Story, not just for his land, but for his punctuality. The records insist on this. They admired his integrity and the fact that he met his obligations on time. In the chaotic, mud-soaked schedule of the frontier, a chief who actually showed up when he said he would must have seemed like a divine revelation to the Presbyterians. They built their homes adjoining one another, creating a neighborhood that was a world as it could be, a fleeting, emotional core where the indigenous population and the encroaching settlers operated as neighbors rather than targets. Prosperity soon arrived in the form of livestock and lectures. The Scots established Eucheeana, a town name honoring both the Euchee Indians and a matriarch named Anna. They cleared the fields and constructed comfortable log bungalows. Colonel McKinnon, Neil's cousin, soon arrived to upgrade the neighbourhood aesthetics by importing a short-horned Durham bull directly from Scotland. One can only imagine the confusion of the local scrub cattle as this bovine aristocrat strutted through the palmettos. The settlers immediately began organising the rest of the landscape. On May 26, 1828, they established the Euchee Valley Presbyterian Church, and shortly after the Knox Hill Academy. It reveals a highly specific cultural obsession to barely finish chopping notches into the pine trees before deciding the local children need more homework and stricter sermons. Yet the cultural exchange went both ways. The Euchee taught the Scots the delicate art of conservation, specifically how to burn the forest without burning down the new log bungalows. In the Panhandle, managing fire is arguably a more practical skill than Latin conjugation. For a dozen years, this mutual protection pact held. The two groups shielded one another from renegade raiders, functioning as a singular community against the chaos of the outside world. McClendon believed the friendship of the Euchee was vital, and for a brief window the tomahawk really was just a tool for marking trees. They shared the venison and the ranges, stood guard over the hybridized town of Eucheeana, and watched the short-horned bull graze in the wiregrass. They lived in the golden light of the valley just before the long shadow of the federal government fell. Sam Story's Stand, Florida's Lost Golden Valley. That long shadow arrived in the form of paperwork. The temporary peace of the Golden Valley felt permanent to those living inside it, but geopolitics rarely respects a handshake. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act arrived as an eviction notice to the indigenous populations of the eastern United States. The threat was no longer a matter of local squabbles. It was imminent federal coercion with a wax seal of approval. The United States had formally acquired Florida in 1821 and carved out Walton County in 1824, steadily tightening an administrative noose around the Euchee and their Scottish neighbours. It is entirely possible to befriend the locals, but it is much harder to befriend a government map that has decided you do not exist. The pressure arrived in two distinct forms: bad neighbours and geometry. First came the newly arriving squatters. Unlike the Scots, who had learned careful fire management from the Euchee, these latecomers treated the forest with the subtle grace of a spring break bender. Sam Story watched with growing unease as these interlopers slashed the timber and indiscriminately burned the range to clear it, destroying both game and soil. They found the Euchee concept of conservation laughable. They could not conceive that an uncivilized Indian might know more about land management than a civilized white man who viewed a forest solely as firewood waiting to happen. Story noted, with the weary disdain of a man watching someone salt his own fields, that these people knew nothing but waste. Then came the grid. Federal surveyors descended on the Panhandle armed with chains, transits, and a bureaucratic obsession with right angles. They began imposing the township and range system over the landscape. This rigid checkerboard cared nothing for the flowing creeks or the tomahawk blazes Sam Story and Neil McClendon had used to mark their boundaries. The grid is the weapon of choice against nature. It takes the rolling, chaotic topography of a watershed and forces it into a spreadsheet. The customary law of the frontier that respected natural geography was being overwritten by the cold, hard logic of the box. Faced with this pincer movement of federal surveyors and pyromaniac squatters, Story and McClendon convened a council in the early 1830s. It was a somber affair. The woods were being wasted. The game was fleeing, and the cooperative peace was cracking. Story looked at the smoke rising from the careless fires of the new arrivals and realized the Golden Valley was closing for business. "Go we must," he concluded. "There is no other way for us to do." He refused to live among people who cared nothing for the days ahead. The chief faced a terrifying choice. He could turn west, but his people carried generational trauma from that direction, remembering constant battles and bloodshed along the Tennessee River. Instead, he chose a strategy of quiet relocation toward the rising sun. He would look east and south along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, hoping to find a sanctuary where the grid had not yet strangled the wilderness. Leaving his son, Jim Crow, to hold the settlement, Story gathered 4 of his sons and 5 other tribesmen. They launched a reconnaissance mission of the highest order, a desperate search for a new refuge in the swamps. For 6 months, this band of explorers traversed the backbone of the Florida peninsula. They pushed as far south as the Everglades, a place Story had visited with his father in his youth, and scoured the Atlantic coast. They navigated sawgrass marshes, dodged alligators that inevitably viewed wading pedestrians as a snack delivery service, and endured the oppressive humidity that defined the territory. They looked for a place with good water, ample game, and, crucially, a complete lack of people who liked to burn things for fun. But the tragedy of the quest lay in its futility. Upon their return, the mood was heavy. They reported finding a few spots that were better in some small regards. Perhaps the mosquitoes were slightly slower, or the sunsets marginally brighter. Ultimately, these new lands were lacking in many other things that this country had. The Golden Valley had set the bar too high. They had settled on no particular place to go. Why did a leader of such capability not simply fight for his land or vanish effectively into the vast interior? Story was a man who understood the long game. He knew that fighting a war against a nation was a losing proposition. Hiding in a swamp that could not sustain his people was merely a slower form of death. They were back where they started, trapped between a grid that wanted to erase them and a horizon that offered no refuge, waiting for the final act to begin. Chief Sam Story's last stand, Euchee exodus to Everglades. Just moments after reading about the chief's failed 6-month odyssey to the Everglades, I stood in the humid air of Walton County, wiping a smear of nutritious Florida mud from my glasses. I was attempting to locate the specific hammock of high ground near Story's Landing, where the final act of this tragedy played out, treating my rental sedan with the rugged caution usually reserved for a moon rover. The map on my phone was spinning in a confused circle, much like Sam Story's scouting party must have done in 1832. They had returned to the Choctawhatchee not with a new deed to paradise, but with the crushing realization that the grass was, in fact, not greener on the other side. It was just swampier. The older chief came back from that arduous trek in a state that historians politely describe as very much exhausted, which is likely the 19th-century diplomatic equivalent of being absolutely shattered. The physical toll of dragging a scouting party halfway to the Atlantic and back had left his health failing, but the emotional blow carried more weight. He was not very well pleased, a phrase carrying the distinct whiff of a British understatement considering he had just realized his people would have to abandon the flowing rivers and wild beauty of the only home they knew. Worn out as he was, Sam immediately threw himself into the logistical nightmare of organizing a tribe of over 500 people for an exodus toward the rising sun. The end came in November 1832 on a night meticulously designed for maximum dramatic impact. The weather had turned bleak, casting a gloom over the valley that felt personal. Sensing the inevitable, Sam sent a messenger through the drizzle to summon his Scottish neighbour, Colonel Mackinnon. The colonel rode out in a midnight storm described in the records as black as Egyptian darkness, a description strongly hinting that the local pioneers read their Bibles thoroughly by candlelight. Inside the chief's tent, illuminated by the dim flicker of a taper, the final council took place. Sam Story did not speak of infections or fever. Instead, he announced that he was under sealed orders from the Great Spirit. It appears the chief had interpreted his failure to find a new home during the scouting trip not as a lack of real estate inventory, but as a divine memo. "There is a better hunting ground for you than this," he told them, pointing toward that last river. He confessed his grief at leaving the Choctawhatchee, then leaned back against the center pole of his tent, gave his son Jim Crow a final nod of leadership, and closed his benignant eyes in peace. Here, the historical record splits into two distinct tracks, much like a decision tree in a choose-your-own-adventure novel written by Presbyterians. Standing near the simple wooden marker, a slab of fat lightwood that sounds suspiciously like an insult to a modern dieter, I contemplated the conflicting accounts of his burial. The local legend, the one that looks best on tourism brochures, claims Sam Story asked to be buried seated, rifle across his lap, facing east to perpetually watch the sunrise and perhaps spook future developers. It presents a powerful image of defiant indigenous sovereignty, a permanent sit-in strike against the Indian Removal Act. However, the written account by John L. McKinnon, the son of the colonel who was actually in the room, tells a different story. According to him, the chief's request was surprisingly specific and bureaucratic. He told the Scots, "I want to be buried in a coffin deep down in the ground after the manner of your burying." This request for a Christian-style interment, complete with a frantic late-night coffin construction project by the colonel and his servant George, suggests a final, complex act of assimilation. It was as if he were stating that if he must leave, he would stay in the earth exactly as the white settlers did. I tried to visualize this solemn carpentry project while battling a distinctly modern annoyance, a localized coastal mosquito buzzing near my ear with exhausting persistence. It struck me as a cruel joke that while the chief was negotiating his spiritual transit, I was negotiating an itch on my ankle, grounding the Egyptian darkness of history in the physical aggravation of the present. His death was a magnificent sleight of hand. By dying when he did, Sam Story lost the chance to lead his people to a new, uncertain home, but he gained something permanent. While his tribe of over 1,000 lingered for 3 weeks of rites before Jim Crow led them east toward the Seminole communities, the old chief achieved ultimate tenure. He never had to leave. By becoming part of the soil itself, buried in the land that became the first county seat of Walton County, he transformed his concession into an unassailable occupancy. The politics of the 1830s could move the living, but they could do absolutely nothing about the dead. Euchee diaspora, kinship and refuge from Florida to Oklahoma. Down by the river where the chief's fresh grave still disturbed the hammock soil, the living hesitated. The tribe lingered for 3 long weeks of rites, delaying the inevitable departure with the desperate stalling of people facing an impossible administrative burden. Pushed against a frontier rapidly shrinking under the pressure of survey lines and settlers, the Euchee found the prospect of a grand exodus to be an overwhelming logistical nightmare. I stood near the site of Story's Landing, watching the dark water of the Choctawhatchee swirl past, and tried to imagine moving 500 people by market boat. It is a massive physical exertion to move a single apartment across town. Moving a civilization into the Florida swamps requires a level of fortitude I simply do not possess. Following the funeral, the mantle of leadership fell to Sam Story's oldest son, Jim Crow Kinnard. He became the designated manager of this displacement, tasked with leading his people away from encroaching white settlements and toward the perceived autonomy of the Everglades. The band drifted south and east, exiting the Choctawhatchee Creek orbit and paddling straight into a conflict zone. It is an acute irony of relocation that searching for a quiet place to live often leads directly into the path of a much louder war. The Euchee migration effectively dissolved their public identity. Once they entered Central and South Florida, the migrating band became entangled in the developing Seminole world, a multi-tribal resistance against the United States that admitted members regardless of their previous affiliations. U.S. military reports displayed a predictable lack of nuance and lumped everyone together. Distinct leaders like Euchee Billy and Euchee Jack were recorded fighting alongside Seminoles in 1837, but in the eyes of the government, they were just more combatants tallied in the Muskogee or Seminole column. It was a clerical error of existential proportions, reducing a unique people to a footnote in someone else's conflict. This filing error persists today in Oklahoma, where the largest population of descendants resides. The Euchee, or Tsoyaha, children of the sun, still speak a linguistic isolate related to absolutely no other tongue on earth. Despite this undeniable uniqueness, they were politically absorbed into the Muskogee Creek Nation during the forced removals of the 1830s. Over 2,000 Euchee individuals are listed as Muskogee on paper, a bureaucratic sleight of hand that denied them federal recognition as a separate tribe in 2000. They remain a distinct people trapped in the wrong administrative folder, keeping their language alive through immersion programs while the government pretends they are someone else. Back in the Florida Panhandle, the local narrative took a turn intimately familiar to anyone who has ever tried to negotiate a family relocation. Despite the grand exodus, the very man designated to lead the departure decided at the last minute to stay put. Jim Crow Kinnard halted his own journey not out of political strategy or military necessity, but out of domestic compromise. His wife, Harriet, a servant formerly belonging to Colonel McKinnon's wife, refused to leave. She hoped her family would eventually arrive from South Carolina and did not want to be hard to find. The chief's son retreated into the deep swamps along the border of Walton and Holmes counties, anchoring his immediate family in the wetlands rather than marching them away. This decision created a distinct sociological pocket in Florida history. Jim Crow and his descendants intermarried with other free people of color and solitary settlers, forming a closed, triracial community near Ponce de Leon. They were locally known as the Dominicas. On the surface, this sounds like a dignified title for a clan of swamp-dwelling survivalists. Scratching that surface reveals an absurd agricultural core. The term refers to the Dominique, a breed of chicken with speckled black and white feathers. Local settlers applied the name of their poultry to a group of human beings based strictly on their complexion. It is a moniker that manages to be descriptively lazy and profoundly rural, tying a unique lineage to a barnyard bird. Historical observers recorded that these descendants maintained long, straight black hair and prominent cheekbones, showing more of the Sam Story race than the mother. They ensured the old chief was not left without a representative in the land he loved. As I drove away from the river, passing signs for Ukiana and the Euchee Valley, I realized the name had stuck to the landscape, even as the original inhabitants were scattered or renamed by neighboring farmers. The peace Sam Story negotiated had only been a temporary deferral. Escaping the immediate pressure of survey lines simply transferred the conflict to the next generation, proving that a frontier struggle is rarely resolved, only relocated. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 8, No Road West for Tim Pucci. Sam Story's 6-month search along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts found no viable refuge, and his death at Story's Landing set 500 people moving toward a future written in other people's records. Their Tsoyaha identity gradually absorbed into broader federal categories, while a Florida remnant and Oklahoma descendants kept the language alive. Next chapter, we move into Walton County's formation and a Civil War story that brings a Connecticut fisherman, a Hungarian revolutionary, and a multiracial Union raiding force through Euchee and all the way to Mariana, so that's one worth staying for. If this journey through the Panhandle's layered past has caught your interest, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conquistadors and Condos. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community over on Patreon. Until next time, this has been The Rise the Limit.